Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 22nd of January and today we're doing a frontline update, primarily focusing on Avdiivka, the Bakhmut Front, and then at the end Kupyansk Front. We're going to begin by looking at the Velika Novosylka sector where we do have a little change that was reported by Deep State on the 21st of January. You see this new polygon with the new color that distinguishes from the orange color that I have marked for the DPR. And so this shows the new advances by the Russians that occurred on the 21st of January. And you can see that it's just to the southeast of Urozhaine, where you have Ukraine's forward operating node in the Velika Novosylka sector. And then in the gray zone, we had this geolocated video from yesterday, which was released from the Bulava FPV drone unit, which is attached to the Presidential Brigade and specifically their 3rd Battalion. So the Presidential Brigade, it's this rather elite unit that the Ukrainians have that has battalions that are serving all across the front line. One of them is serving still on the Velika Novosylka sector. And so their FPVs were able to chase away the Russian squad, which had around a dozen men, which is a pretty large number for a squad that's working together on the front line. But nonetheless, this is the positional advance that we saw. We also saw this video that was released from the Russian side of their FPV drone operators hitting Ukrainian ammo depots, troop concentrations, and radio stations within the village. And that's really about it for the sector. It's probably the quietest, if not really one of the quietest sectors on the entire front line right now. Now moving on to Avdiivka, there is a small Russian advance that was reported by the Ukrainian source Deep States. You could actually see the extent of that gain over here on market with this red color from the previous geolocation that we have in blue. And so you can see that these are very small advances at each turn, but slowly they're chipping away at Ukraine's positions in the easternmost parts of this village. Now moving on to a part of the front where the advances are relatively large in scale, we look at southern Avdiivka. On the 21st of January, the Russians took advantage of their breakthrough past the Ukrainian defensive positions that we discussed in the earlier video that are built around rail lines and the forested areas and in the areas just to the west of the industrial zone. So basically this red line over here, the Russians took advantage of their breakthrough control over Tsarska Ohota, the college over there, or the cottages, sorry, and the trench fortifications built up by the Ukrainians just to the north of it. And due to the fact that the Ukrainians simply didn't have the manpower to respond to this Russian assault, which was not just an infantry-based assault, but there was also an armored component that we're going to get to, due to the surprise and due to a myriad of other factors that I talked about in my earlier video, the Ukrainians were not able to regroup and establish a new line within the southern outskirts. And so they were completely pushed out of this south or southernmost residential quarter of the city of Avdiivka that you could see marked in blue over here. And so throughout the 20th and 21st, the Russians, their assault groupings, their forward operating forces that entered into this region, they started clearing out the houses. And we have proof of this based on videos that were released on 21st and 22nd by Ukraine's 110th Mechanized Brigade, which is the main Ukrainian fighting force that's defending in this region. And as I talked about in the other video, this unit is really not receiving the sufficient amount of support, whether it be in manpower or resources, to hold back various Russian units that are working in tandem to conduct their current assaults. But nonetheless, it releases video which shows about 30 FPV drone strikes on Russian assault squads as they were advancing through Tsarska Ohota and then into this residential section as well. We have one of such geolocation over here within the westernmost parts of this residential quarter, as the Russian forces were trying to consolidate control over there. And then in a different video, we see that there were drone drops. They dropped grenades onto the Russian assault squad, which did cause some casualties. But either way, that is confirmation that the Russian forces are now located in this region around the garages as well. And along the main road in this region, the Soborna Street, which is now being reported by Russian sources as a hub or epicenter for Ukrainian shelling. The Ukrainians have directed some of their artillery capabilities in the region to shelling the Russian groupings, specifically in this red rectangle. In terms of the scale of the gains from 21st and 22nd, we'll see that the Russians were able to get control over 0.8 square kilometers in this region within the red rectangle. And in terms of the distance from Tsarska Ohota to the line of contact is about 1.6 kilometers. At the same time, the Russian forces continue clearing out the Skotovata area. There's no more Ukrainian presence over here. The Russians really are solidifying control. There is still a possibility of the situation being fluid in the forested areas where I'm going to just go over in yellow for a second. And so that area still has to be cleared. But for the most part, the Ukrainian forces that were able to withdraw in time, they have tried to build up a new line of defense in the residential areas, basically around the current Ukrainian line of contact that you see marked in blue on my map over here. So at the moment, the Russian forces are in the process of clearing out what does look like a gray zone salient over here. And during that time period, the front line is also going to be shortened, with the main Ukrainian cluster in this section being centered around Lermontova Street and Kolosova Street over here. So here's an extremely quick sketch I did of the front line. Really, the point is that you can see that within the Russian zone of control now, they do have this control over the industrial zone, they have control over the residential quarter that we were talking about, and throughout those entire fortification systems. And look at the elevation that the Russians now have control over. They have control of all the heights on the southern outskirts of Avdiivka, and really the only height that the Ukrainians still have to their advantage, which can't really be scaled, it can't really be factored within the topographic map, is the Khimik Industrial District, which you could see over here in blue. It does look to be on rather low elevation, but when you account for the fact that there were high-rise apartment buildings in this region that overlook the entire area, then it is a very good vantage point for the Ukrainian forces, and it also makes very great firing positions for them. But besides that, the Russian forces have control of all the other heights that are overlooking the Ukrainian positions that are within these rather low valleys within the eastern sections especially, but also in the central part of Avdiivka. At the same time, the Russian control over these heights also allows them to overlook the Ukrainian positions and the supply routes leading into the Zenit abandoned air defense base, which is marked over here in blue. And we're going to talk about this now. So as you can see, first of all, this entire area is located on a valley between these two lines, which was previously a very significant Ukrainian salient. Now there is some ambiguity as to the status of the air defense base, because we did receive reports earlier today from the Russian side where they claimed that they were able to storm this region, and this is not something that was ubiquitous within Russian sources. So just as an example, Rybar on their map that was recently released a couple hours ago, they show this base as being a gray zone. And just if you're not aware, this base has been serving as a Ukrainian forward salient to prevent the Russian forces from advancing further north towards the Khimik industrial, or not industrial, sorry, residential zone. And by virtue of the Ukrainians holding on, the Russian forces have really been unable to reiterate their focus further northwards. And so in that regard, it has been a very important strong point for the Ukrainians. And so the fall of this strong point would have very big ripple effects for the entire region. And so that's why we have to be very careful before making such a significant claim. And so I'm not saying with 100% certainty that this area was captured. There was a video released that was circulating through the Russian information space of, I believe, 4 Ukrainian POWs that were captured in a certain building. And the claim was that it was recorded in one of these houses over here that's a part of the air defense base. And just if you don't know, this air defense base, it has trenches, it has dugouts, has basements, and probably has tunnels, but I don't know for certain. And so we don't have proof yet of that video being from this region over here. We're not sure if the geolocation is correct. So I'm just going to stay on the safe side, as even deep states, which is pretty reliable when it comes to these changes, they are not saying whether this is true or not. They're not certain either. And so there is a lot of conflicting information, but it is extremely likely that the Russian forces did take advantage of their advances to the northeast of the air defense base around here in order to put additional pressure onto the Ukrainian garrison that is stationed in this base. And the Ukrainian garrison stationed over here, some reports have said that it's actually part of the separate presidential brigade that we were talking about earlier in today's video. And so that would be pretty interesting that these elite forces would be moved into that specific direction to hold the line. But when the Russian forces really did expand their zone of control into this residential area, it did make it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to hold on to this air defense base. And you could clearly see the reason why. Now you have these two flanks that are only separated by about 2 or 3 kilometers, and that entire zone is in a valley in a low area with several open fields and minor local roads connecting between the main Ukrainian line and the Ukrainian forward node. And so transportation, retreat, resupply, for instance, all of that became even more difficult than it was before. and the Ukrainians in that area were already in a very desperate situation, that close to the front line, being enveloped on three sides. So really, we're gonna have to wait and see to get a full picture of the status of this base later on. But in terms of Ukraine's next steps, once it does eventually fall, the Ukrainians do have fortifications that were built up along the cottages located over here around this blue line. So there are trenches built in that direction, although that area is also being enveloped right now by the Russian advance that occurred in the residential quarter. And you also have this tree line that was built over here, or this tree line running along this road, and an even larger tree line that runs along this road just to the south of the Kimik residential district. And so those lines are definitely being built up by the Ukrainians to prevent the Russian forces from directly attacking the residential district that's so key to Ukraine's long-term defensive plans in this area from the south. Something which I discussed in my last video about the reasons for why the Russians were able to break through in some of these areas is due to the fact that the Ukrainians did not sufficiently mine or have enough mobile ATGM crews in the southern outskirts of Avdiivka to push back the Russian armored assaults that acted as spearheads for the infantry that advanced in tandem. And of course, I understand the reasons why it's difficult to put a large amount of mines within a dense urban area, but nonetheless, it doesn't change the fact that the Russians took advantage of that and sent in their own armor, both during the assaults a couple of months ago along Gastovitsky lane in the industrial zone of Avdiivka, but also now in the assaults from a couple of days ago towards Artska Ohota. And so you had a lot of Russian armor that was advancing along the ring road of Donetsk and then all the way up into the cottages. And this was actually caught on camera by the Ukrainian side. We have this actual geolocated footage, which shows that there was at least one abandoned T-72 and then two BMPs that were abandoned by the Russian side. Again, this is within Russian controlled lines, so I don't know if they're going to be retrieved later on. But in any case, this shows that there was an involvement of Russian armor that assisted in the assaults. And according to Deep State, actually, during the expansion of Russia's offensive in this direction, there were 18 vehicles that were involved in the fighting within this pretty small zone of fighting. That's really something like 800 or going towards 1.5 kilometers in width. Now moving on to the Bakhmut Front around Avdiivka, or Andriivka actually, on the 21st of January, there was a slight change with the Russian forces advancing from their front line to the east of the rail line and actually succeeding in clearing out some dugouts that were originally created by them and then taken over by the Ukrainians. Now they're being taken back by the Russians once again on this tree line just to the right of the rail line, and this has really become an area of positional fighting where every now and then you have either side with FPV strikes on groupings that are advancing towards a lot of contact, and sometimes infantry that is storming the dugouts. You don't even see that many trenches. In a lot of these cases, it's just individual dugouts for a couple of infantrymen. And now just going a bit to the north, we do have a slight change in the Klishivka area where we did see fighting die down following the Russian attacks that really intensified in the early stages of December. So in December, the Russians were actually able to advance from their positions in the valleys located in the forest in this attack vector and make their way up the hill on which Ukrainians were located on the most fortified parts of the Klishivka sector. And they do still have a foothold within this fortified hill, especially in the northeast where all the trenches are located, while the Ukrainians do still have a presence in the southwest. But at the same time, the Ukrainians, they've been able to hold the line and prevent a larger collapse of the village of Klishivka itself, although it is located on a valley. And the reason why they've been able to sustain this is because all of the areas in the fields to the west of Klishivka are on rather high elevation, so they do have fire support and they do have a good field of vision to look at the Russian side. And so that includes all these areas where I'm going over right now with this blue line. And so taking over this fortified height is of course important on a local level, but when you look at the bigger picture, there are many other heights that the Ukrainians are using to their advantage. And that might be some of the rationale behind the Russian attack that occurred 2 days ago in this direction, with Russian infantry squad launching an attack from their positions in this forested region. And as a result, they were able to advance slightly, you could say by a couple hundred meters. I'll actually measure it right now, almost a kilometer, taking over some additional forested areas and fields along this individual road. And eventually they were pushed back by the Ukrainians. It was a rather small squad from what I saw, 3, 4 soldiers retreating back to their current Russian lines. And in the process, one of the T-72s that was accompanying them was also abandoned in the pursuit. And so that should give us an idea of the Ukrainians being able to stabilize the line and the Russians expanding their vectors of attack even further north from the fortified area over here. Additionally, not much happened around Avdiivka. We just have clarification of the front line based off of two videos from both sides. This first video is from the Española brigade of the Russian forces, and their FPV hits a Ukrainian lodging station in northern Avdiivka. So this does give us an indication that there are still Ukrainian forces holding out in this gray zone despite Russian attacks from the flanks and directly from within the village. We've not seen any sort of major movement from this area just yet. And at the same time, we have this video of the Ukrainians directing fire towards a Russian flag that was raised in the northernmost outskirts of Avdiivka, which did give us confirmation that the Russian forces are present in this area. Although that's really been the case for several weeks, they only raised the flag now. And the unit that directed fire and released this video was the 24th Mechanized Brigade, which I think is the most interesting part of all this episode, really because this unit was operating around the quarries to the northwest of Horlivka. If you remember, they were able to get control of some of those areas, but then were eventually pushed back by the Russian forces back to the original 2014-esque line. And it appears that the Ukrainians have reevaluated their priorities and moved this unit further north to the Bakhmut sector, where they're desperately needed in order to prevent further Russian advances, especially around an area like Avdiivka, but they could also be used around Ivanivske or further south around Klishivka. Now, to the northeast of Soledar, there's another area that I was unable to mention, and this is a gain that occurred on the 18th of January, and this was the Russian capture of the village of Vesele. This was reported on by Deep State, and in the 4 days that have passed since then, they've not adjusted their map anymore, so it does seem like this is pretty likely something that occurred. And if you look at the topography of this region, you'll understand why the Ukrainians had to withdraw and why the Russians ended up capturing this village. The Russians have been launching the sustained efforts of advancing along the rail line located over here along this vector of attack, just to the west of Berestove, located over here. And the reason they've been doing that is because the area, first of all, has a lot of dugouts and trenches that the Ukrainians built, and the Russians were able to clear some of them out. And it's also located on a local height. And that height does give the Russians the advantage because when you look at the Ukrainian lines around Vesele that they previously had, those are located on a very low elevation. Basically, this entire area that I'm going over in blue, that is currently the Ukrainian front line, is located on a very low elevation. So the Russians are able to flank them from the east, first of all, by advancing along this salient that you see over here, this orange salient that I've marked on my map. They were able to do that, first of all. And the salient itself was also located on a high elevation. And so they overlooked this Ukrainian valley. And if you look at Vesele itself, it is a very small village. It's relatively isolated from the rest of the Ukrainian positions within the Seversk salient itself, which is the wider Ukrainian grouping in this region, because there is a very large open field separating those main Ukrainian villages that are connected together by several roads to this one pretty small isolated village. And so they were already at a massive disadvantage of the Ukrainian garrison over here. But really, the straw that broke the camel's back was the pressure that was coming in from the northeast. And so the territorial defense unit that was defending in this area, I've just moved up their position further north. And now this gives the Russians a new attack vector from the east that could be used to assault the Ukrainian positions that are located in Urozhaine. Urozhaine is a stronger garrison. It's more connected to the Ukrainian front line and is defended by a better unit, the 10th Mountain Assault Brigade. Now, the last part of the front line we're going to discuss is the Kupyansk Front, and this time we're going to talk about an area that has really not been covered much, and that's part of why the Russians decided to advance in this direction. The previous front line in this region was based around the rail line, which makes sense. You can mark it in red, and that's basically where the demarcation line was. And then on the 20th of January, seemingly out of nowhere, because this part of the front line was relatively quiet for the past couple of weeks, the Russians did launch an attack, which allowed them to get control over the village of Krokhmalne. And there is a photo of them raising the flag in this area, and it was also admitted by the Ukrainian side that the Russian forces were able to capture this specific village. And so in terms of the gains that the Russians were able to achieve in this new attack, they were able to get control over around 16 square kilometers. And in terms of the extent of the advance, you could see that at most it was about 3 kilometers. Now, as a result, the Russian forces were also able to reach the P-07 road, which is a key highway that the Ukrainians are using to sustain connection between the main garrison in this part of the front line in eastern Kupyansk and then connect it to the Ukrainian forces on the front line. And the largest Ukrainian force on the front line over here is within this cluster of 4 villages. This is an area that the Russians began attacking very heavily in November from Yahidne all the way to Ivanivka, and that assault ended up being repelled by the Ukrainians. And so it seems like the Russians got an understanding of the fact that these 4 villages are extremely fortified and that their defense garrisons are very strong. And so they looked elsewhere for opportunities to advance. And the best area to launch their new attack was a bit further south, where it's less dense, there's less defenses likely, and there was probably less manpower. And so that would be the rationale behind the Russian assault in this direction. Now, my mapping is based off of the confirmed advances, but I know that, for instance, Russian sources like Rybar, they're now claiming that the Russian forces have been able to advance even deeper and begin assaults on Berestove, Tabaivka, that was mentioned, and the front line on some mappers' maps is even closer to Kotlyarivka. I don't know if that's true, but in terms of the opportunities this gives the Russians, it would allow them to open up all of those attack vectors, especially the one on Kotlyarivka, in order to flank the 4 villages that are extremely necessary for the Russians to capture in order to eliminate Ukraine's frontline strongholds on the Kupyansk Front. The thing that's very interesting about this part of the front line is that you really only have 2 key lines to the east of the Oskil River. Of course, there are many local ones that you could set up or look at, but you have, first of all, the frontline villages where the Ukrainians are currently defending, and then when you go further westwards and measure with the measuring stick, there's around 12, 13, 14 kilometers of just open fields before you reach the next villages where roads are connecting all of them. So that's extremely interesting. And when you look at the elevation in the areas that the Russians have just captured, this area over here in blue is located on a relatively low elevation. This is all a valley. The Ukrainians, they have access to one ridge over here, and that serves as their high ground, and that extends into this 4 town cluster. And that's also why this part of the front line is important for the Ukrainians. It's a large operating node, very dense, that gives you a solid control of the surrounding regions. But at the same time, the Russians also have control of their own ridge located over here in red that I'm going over on the furthest right part of the screen. And so now the Russian forces that took over Krokhmalne and this part of the highway, they are overlooking the Ukrainian defensive positions that are holding in Berestove, Pischane, Tabaivka, etc. in all of this parts of the valley. And so do keep an eye out for what the Russians do over here. Also keep an eye out for whether the Ukrainians send in reinforcements to hold the line from the Sinkivka part of the front line or from around Pershotravneve, because that is definitely something that could happen to prevent further Russian advances. And so that's all I have for today. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.